Hey folks, Randy Newberg here with another episode of Leupold's Hunt Talk Radio. Today I have a guest, Theodore Roosevelt IV, the great-grandson of President Roosevelt. He's been on this podcast before. And we've been out in Montana elk hunting. Ted shot an elk. I was just along for moral support. But I asked him if he would be willing to do a podcast because Ted comes from a legacy of people who really have a high priority for hunting and conservation and a very low priority for partisanship. And while we've been walking around, sitting and glassing, had a lot of time to talk about things, he has expressed to me his concerns about where we're going and what the future of some of this might be. And, you know, he's at the point in his life where he said he can't worry about hurt feelings. He can't worry about, the fact that his family has been associated with one party forever, and he still holds out hope for that. But I asked him if he'd repeat some of these things on a podcast, and so I just want you to brace yourself that some of what we're going to cover, some of the points that will probably be made, might not be what some people want to hear. It is not going to be a rah-rah cheerleading podcast if Ted brings forth some of the comments and observations. But as he said, neither side has all the solutions, and he's not blind to the fact that all sides have their flaws. And as policy has become so much more about politics, it's critical that we as hunters engage, or we're going to get the outcome that we've let happen. And he remarked how impressed he was this summer when the hunting community led the charge to stop Mike Lee in his amendment to sell public lands. And he's given me a lot of his thoughts and comments and perspectives of his life experience about how that's an example of how things should work and could work. And so I appreciate him being here. We're going to try fit this in between breakfast and us going over and taking care of the elk that he shot yesterday. And I hope that you all take it for what it's worth. I hope nobody gets offended by statement of certain facts that might not reflect well on certain decisions that are being made. And it is what it is. And we can't disregard that. We can't ignore it. And talking about it and making sure that we are, I guess, I wouldn't say even outspoken, but we are well-spoken in where our priorities are. That's the most important part. It doesn't matter who you vote for. What matters is what you advocate for and the fact that you engage and advocate with as much priority as you can. So I appreciate y'all being here. I know this has been quite a while since we've had a podcast release. We got some more that are coming up here in the can. But I have been on the road nonstop. It's that time of year. I had a couple that we were supposed to roll out, but due to my schedule and the schedule of others, we had to push them. So between now and the end of the year, we're going to spoon feed you a whole lot more hunting, conservation, and advocacy here on Hunt Talk Radio. I can't tell you how much I appreciate all of you. The number of people who remark to me that this podcast audience is one of the most engaged and effective groups of people that they know. I agree with that, and it's because of all of you that our platforms have any validity in the public discussion. So thanks for being here. Hope you enjoy this discussion, and while you're listening to it, while they're editing it, Ted and I are going to be out taking care of his elk.
As I went walking, I saw a sign there, and on the sign it said no trespassing, but on the other side it said nothing. Well, that's right, it was made for you and me.
Well, folks, I am here. We are in central Montana, and with me is Theodore Roosevelt IV. You go by Ted.
I do go by Ted.
And
Theodore is a name that was used for the old lion. He died more than 100 years ago.
you've been on this podcast before, Ted, and we've been conversing, emailing, and sharing ideas about conservation and advocacy for quite a while now. And the most important part to some people is you are here in Montana with an elk tag in your pocket.
Absolutely. And I was so happy to get the elk tag. I used to be a landowner in Montana, and for a variety of reasons, my family urged me no longer to sell the ranch, which was a terrible decision on my part when I agreed. But I love hunting in Montana, and I particularly love hunting elk. There is no better big game to hunt than elk in Montana.
Well, I would agree with that, and I think a lot of the listeners would agree with that. And so we were lucky. I made a phone call to a family that I've been trustee for a long time, and they will quickly explain to you how elk and fences are not compatible. And they welcomed the opportunity for you to come over here. They allowed us to stay in this guest cabin that we're sitting in right now. And you have a nice bull elk hanging in the shop this morning, thanks to your fine shooting yesterday.
Well, fine shooting may be, excuse me, an exaggeration. But we did have an extraordinary opportunity to shoot and get a bull elk. And one of the things about an elk is the backstrap and loin, and the steaks that you get out of the hindquarters is one of the finest kinds of eating that you can have. And I like cooking them up, and cooking them with mushrooms, particularly morels, which grow in Montana, and make a great sauce for it. And even my non-hunting urban friends in New York City, when I serve them this, they say, that was good.
Now I understand why you go to Montana hunting, is what they probably said.
Yes.
Well, the wind was blowing, and blowing intensely. And we're very fortunate that those elk, when Jess, the other hunter, shot, that they made a very long route to get to us, but they came down 150 yards below us. And I looked at the footage this morning. Almost 7 minutes you waited there for your shot opportunity. And you made the most of it in that very, very strong wind.
So you're sort of asking the question, why did I wait? The elk were running in a bunch, and if I tried to select one in a bunch, I might have made a mistake and shot a small spike elk, or shot two at the same time. So I had to wait. And the other thing I noticed was that when they initially came down and I was kneeling, I could not hold the gun steady in the wind. The wind was that strong, it would shake, and I did not have. So I learned that if I moved slightly to my left, I could lean and hold the gun against a strong pine tree that had no branches on it. And eventually I waited long enough, and I put the gun on safety. And then eventually the herd started going slowly, and then there were some stragglers. And I picked out a bull straggler and was extraordinarily lucky because the wind was blowing so hard that it would have an impact on the trajectory of the bullet. And to be honest, I shot a little higher than I should have, and that was a mistake on my part. But the bull dropped instantly.
Well, you made a remarkable shot in that wind. And I was...
Now remember, Randy exaggerates.
The audience knows that.
It was a lucky shot.
It was not a lucky shot. It was the absolute epitome of patience under adverse conditions. And that bull, well, He has your tag now because of that.
He did, and I was really happy to get it. But it also allowed me to come out and see Randy again and talk about something that we both consider to be incredibly important. What is that? That is the obligation that hunters all across America have to do three things. Number one is we have to hold our politicians accountable, because if they're given an opportunity to do the wrong thing, they almost inevitably will take that opportunity. And it reminds me a little bit of Winston Churchill's famous statement about the United States, or as he said, America. America will always do the wrong thing first, but ultimately they will finally make the right choice. And we're seeing that with respect to public policy on public lands. And we're seeing what I call an event where we're seeing history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
Yeah.
And what do I mean by that? At the end of World War II, and just a little bit before its end, a series of Western interests decided that they wanted to privatize much of the federal lands and give it to individuals living in the Western states who would have been enriched enormously by getting cheap ownership of much of our public lands. And there was one man, Bernard DeVoto, who was a historian and also he taught Arthur Schlesinger how to write. And Arthur Schlesinger says that in his book about Bernard DeVoto. And Bernard DeVoto, writing aggressive and so much on point letters and articles in Harper's Bazaar, he single-handedly stopped this movement. And we end up still having our public lands largely protected through his efforts.
Yeah.
And it is not an exaggeration. Using modern communication skills, Randy is today's Bernard DeVoto. But what that means is that all hunters have to help Randy do this. We have to hold Congress accountable and make Congress function again.
Yeah.
And all of you are familiar with Senator Lee's proposed amendment to have authorization to sell 200 to 300 million acres of public lands. This is because in Utah, some of the more conservative members of the GOP think they want to have that land for a bunch of reasons. They are not honoring the original agreement that Utah made when it became a state, and there was an agreement struck between the federal government and people in Utah that so much land would be given to the state, and they would honor that agreement and not ask for more. Now they're asking for more. Yeah. And that is not honorable, because if you agree to something, you should honor the agreement you've made. The second issue is that we are seeing the wilderness designation in this country under the most severe threat that has been under since the passage of the Wilderness Act in 1964. The lands can only be designated wilderness when Congress agrees to it, and they're not going to agree to it until the state officials generally support it, and then a wilderness designation is made because it is viewed as being the greatest good for the greatest number to protect some of that land. Now we're seeing in Alaska, we are seeing wilderness designations be removed arbitrarily by one man, and I'm sure you know who that one man is, and that is wrong. We have to stand up and make sure, because once we allow this to happen once, it will be repeated again and again till there is very little wilderness left. And so in Alaska, where this designation is to construct a road that would go for 211 miles to a non-existent mine that would, in theory, mine copper. Well, of course, we're going to need copper. but we can get copper elsewhere without destroying some of the most magnificent wilderness areas in all of North America. Alaska is the last frontier where all Americans can go. Admittedly, it's hard to get to, but you can see wilderness as it existed for 5 millennia. There are very few parts of the world where you can do that. So now let me come back, and I'm getting very long-winded here, so I apologize. Maybe they can edit it down.
The mic is yours, Ted.
In America, we have what we call the American model. No other country has this model. What this model is that, thanks to our forebears, we have large amounts of the country that are protected in the form of Bureau of Land Management, national forests, many of which the old line helped set up, national parks, wildlife refuges. And we have mixed use. Hunters are allowed to hunt in our national forests. They're allowed to hunt in Bureau of Land Management areas. They're not allowed, with a few very rare exceptions, to hunt in national parks. But we have, in our national forest, ranchers can graze their cattle, which is good for the forest. And again, it goes back to Gifford Pinchot's the greatest good for the greatest number. Yeah. No other country allows its public to have access to lands where they can hunt. Almost all the lands in Europe are held privately. So they're members of very wealthy families or aristocrats who've had lands for a long time. And there is no such thing as public hunting on public lands. So this is a gift that we have. Now, as hunters, we have to do everything we can to protect that gift. We are stewards for future generation and for our children's children, or as the phrase the TR used, those who are unborn in the womb of time. And we have to honor that obligation, and to do otherwise results in what I call intergenerational theft. In other words, we would be stealing for our own benefit the rights of future generations. And that, again, would be wrong.
Yeah.
I'll stop there for a moment.
Well, that's a great start, Ted, because, when you and I talk on these things, most of the audience, if anyone in the audience doesn't know the conservation story of what your family calls him, the old lion, that being Theodore Roosevelt, 26th President of the United States, who is on Mount Rushmore. You talk about this going that far back of his commitment to those yet unborn, those in, as you just said, in the womb of time. And you carry with you today a very strong attitude that is not something America can let go. And I always admire how your life of hunting and engagement in conservation has been an expression of so much of what we read about, as the term I just say, the old lion, so that you know exactly who I'm referring to. And it started there. He was part of this populist movement that America is going to have wild places and it's going to have wildlife. And he brought together himself, Gifford Pinchot, who you mentioned, George Bird Grinnell, and the list goes on and on and on of people who they started this movement. And it was a generational inheritance that has went from generation to generation. And the danger of who we are, and the danger of every generation, is once you lose it and give up on it, you don't get a chance to get it back. Subdivisions don't go back to being wild places. Roads and reservoirs and everything else don't go back to being wild places. Those are in perpetuity. Those will be in perpetuity. And so we can't afford to lose even one time. And that causes us to be a little bit maybe more outspoken and passionate than maybe some people expect. But I think that's good.
If we have an obligation, we have a fiduciary obligation to protect these assets, which we have to protect these assets for all future generations. And it's in the same way, if you were a trustee for any kind of a trust or for a non-governmental organization, you have a fiduciary responsibility. And so all hunters, because we are beneficiaries of this, and in fact all of Americans, have the obligation to ensure that we pass these assets down to future generations.
Yeah. Have in your life of being involved in all this stuff, you lived through the period of you referred to the Wilderness Act of 1964. In your lifetime, we've seen the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Federal Land Management Act, FLIPMA. You've seen a lot of really good legislation come forward that was Americans standing up and saying, hey, this is what we want. And am I correct in my statement that today we are at greater risk of putting the vehicle in, or that idea in reverse, rather than continuing to stand on the gas?
I think you're absolutely right, Randy, and it disturbs me immensely. A few weeks ago, I was invited by the Montana State University to come and be interviewed by an historian. And one person asked me, what were the dangers that most concerned me about this country? Well, the first one I mentioned, and I've spent a lot of my life trying to address it, is climate change. All hunters see the impact of climate change. It's obvious. All fishermen see it. We see in Montana that there are times when we have to shut off fishing in the rivers because we're putting too much pressure on the trout. And Montana has an incredible fishery resource, but we have to protect it. And the second one I mentioned was that our political system has broken down today. Republicans will not talk to Democrats, and the bipartisan deadlock where neither party wants to work with the other, and they're very shrill in how they attack the others. And again, this is wrong, and that's one of the reasons why I keep using the phrase, hunters have to hold the parties and their political representatives accountable. They were sent to Washington to represent you and all Americans, and I am a Republican. I suspect I will die as a Republican unless there is a third party which emerges, which will return to the virtues that made the Republican Party great for a while. And now, today, the Republican Party is not great in my opinion. And because I had been a delegate to two presidential campaigns representing New York, I think I have earned the right to criticize my party. And I want to see it return to the old values, but I don't think under its current leadership we're going to see that. And so that I'll call it dysfunction of our political system is a grave challenge, and we cannot tolerate this much longer. We have to see the parties learn how to treat each other with respect and work together. And I'll tell you a story about one of my former colleagues who was a trustee or a member of the governing council of the Wilderness Society, the former representative and then Senator Gaylord Nelson from Wisconsin. And Gaylord and his wife used to hold dinners, and he would deliberately invite people from both parties to come to the dinner so he could break bread with them and get to know them better. And he was also a wonderful mimic. He tells the story how at one point he invited another fellow senator. The senator came over, and I'm now trying to do what Gaylord did. Gaylord said, the senator came up and said to me, Gaylord, that damn bill you got don't make no damn sense. I can't imagine why you're doing it. It's the stupidest darn thing I ever did see. But you're such a nice guy, I'll vote for it anyway. We need to restore that kind of ability to get together and our Congress. I was not long ago invited to, probably about 18 months ago, have lunch with a senator in the Senate dining room. And I looked around and I said, Senator, there's nobody else here today. Why is that? And he said, sadly, we don't dine together anymore. That
Wow.
is wrong. And we need to get people to go to Washington and work together. And part of the problem is a problem that the Supreme Court has imposed on us, and it needs to be rectified. Politicians spend probably 80% of their working hours trying to raise money for their next election.
Yeah.
They don't do the work they were sent to Washington to do.
Yeah. Well, when the Supreme Court made their decision in the Citizens United case, that opened the door to pretty much unlimited amounts of money. And we're paying the price for that today through the dysfunction that we see. And, a lot of people who follow policy end up following politics. I mean, they have the same root word. And I don't think very many people would disagree with your assessment of the complete dysfunction and the consequence that has for us. And in the sphere of public lands and conservation, it has allowed what I call the vandals to have the levers of power. And right now, we are seeing it. I look at it here in Montana. We have the BLM spent years and years in Montana, the Dakotas, other places, putting together resource management plans. And thousands and thousands of people commented and attended meetings and gave input. Just the general public did that. And now all that gets thrown out the window for reasons I struggle to understand, where they say, no, we're gonna override those resource management plans. We see, well, you mentioned Mike Lee. He came out with this ridiculously wide bill, and after getting his teeth handed to him, he kept trying to narrow it down. But that's an expression of people who do not view public lands and the public conservation legacy of the United States as anything more than what can my generation do to maximize it, and hell with future generations. And if anyone thinks that we have intergenerational mindsets in Congress, look at just our fiscal irresponsibility. I mean, we are handing next generations trillions and trillions of dollars of debt. And so in times like this, and I know people might get tired of me saying this, but it's incumbent upon us, those of us who have voices, those of us who have platforms, to stand up and speak up. And sometimes the right thing to do is to speak up behind, maybe in a meeting or in a private meeting. Sometimes it's the right thing to stand up and speak very publicly and very loudly. But we have to be speaking up. I will feel so terrible if my generation is the generation that lets this slip away. And those young people don't have the opportunities that I've had, don't get to see wild places that were wild when I was young but are now tame. Those are things that I lose a lot of sleep over. And you are always such a light of encouragement.
Well, let's look at some of the things that are being contemplated now. I mentioned the one man deciding that the Wilderness Act can be overridden by his voice alone, despite it was passed by Congress. Another example of this is that there is an effort to repeal the roadless rule. Now, the roadless rule, which applies to about 45 million acres of our national forest, 44.7 to be precise, and represents roughly 1/3 of the national forests that we have. The roadless rule applied generally to areas that were inaccessible and would be hard to timber, and also didn't have our best timber. But if we go in and build roads in there, we will open them up to the possibility of more fire, because most fires get started not by lightning, but by human agency. And the roadless rule would also be repealed for the Tongass National Forest, which is the only remaining temperate forest in Alaska. It's a rainforest, and it's utterly unique. And putting in repealing it will allow that to be destroyed in ways that makes no sense. And unfortunately, the people, the proponents about this, are saying, "Oh, this is this will reduce. This will reduce the risk of fire." Well, the reason that fire is greater in our national forest than it had been, say, 20 years ago, is a direct result of climate change. It will, not reduce the risk of fire, because when you allow more human intrusion in, you have the possibility of more fire. But it will do immense damage to the wilderness areas and the roadless areas in our national forest. There's no justification for this, but as Randy said, it is another way in which a very selfish generation is saying, we want it for ourselves. But it is also, and the Republican Party, the GOP, recognizes it, the great big beautiful bill is going to add to our national deficit significantly. They realize this. So what do? They come up with irresponsible solutions to the lack of fiscal responsibility they've shown. They say, well, let's sell some of the public lands and we'll get some money for it. Let's reduce payments to Medicaid. So they don't want to acknowledge that we don't have a fiscal system that's operative now. And we're making it far harder, this gets a little technical, for the Federal Reserve, which works very well. And we have an individual who doesn't like how it works because as it sees in the best of its ability, if we lower interest rates too soon, we'll end up having inflation. And inflation steals from everybody. So I am very critical of the fiscal policies espoused by my party. And I'm looking to the hunting community to hold Congress responsible for having better fiscal policies than we currently do.
Yeah, that fiscal policy becomes an excuse for let's sell public lands. Let's give quasi-ownership to corporate interests of our natural resources. Let's lower regulations that have been in place for decades and use our fiscal and economic demands as the reason for doing, I'll just say, serious damage to the regulatory framework that makes sure that when we do resource extraction, we do it to the best of what we can, because we all need those resources, and no one says we don't. The simplification of this is, oh, well, you drive a car, so you should be in favor of this. We look at so many of these things that have happened, where we just had big coal leases in Montana. They removed the coal leasing, or changed the coal leasing rules in Montana, and they had a huge auction, and nobody really bid on them. We've had oil and gas sales that nobody really bid on. We have mining companies who say, we don't really want that. But we have ideologues within the power structure who say, well, we're going to do it anyhow. And that's not reflective of how we got here. It's not reflective of the public input, the process of compromise, the process of trying to find solutions that work for us. That's why I keep saying, I think that it is a reflection of, to the victor goes the spoils, and let's hand the levers of power to the most vandalistic people within those who were the victors. And I know some people are going to say, that's really harsh, Randy, but it is really hard. It needs to be harsh. There's really no soft way to put it. Because when I've always been a very pragmatic person. I've thought that compromise and such gets you further than just digging in your heels. But I just spent 2 weeks in the Yukon, in the wildest of wild places. And it showed me what compromise has done to the wildness of the lower 48. And we will never get that back. But it makes every piece of wild ground even that more valuable because of how scarce it is and how little of it remains in the lower 48. So when I see people, I'm going to use a name here. There's a person at OMB, Office of Management and Budget, who's very much an ideologue. Was kind of one of the co-authors of the Project 2025. And if you read the public lands portion of Project 2025, we're seeing a lot of that in place right now. And the director of OMB selected a person to write the public land portion. I believe it's chapter 13 of Project 2025, William Perry Pendley, who's written extensively about his belief that we need to sell all of our public lands. He's made no hidden feelings about that at all. And now that person who was a co-author of that document is running OMB. OMB is exercising its influence in every policy decision, every places where OMB traditionally has never been involved. And so it's an example of the ideologues taking advantage of the opportunity that's been created. And, whether you vote for President Trump or didn't vote for President Trump, I always tell people, I don't care who you voted for. I care what you do when the issue comes up. None of us are ever going to find on either side the person we agree with 100% of the time, probably not even 80% of the time. But I think if you look at the president's life experiences, he has no reason to have a connection to these public lands and this conservation story. He did the Great American Outdoor Act in his first administration, which was a wonderful thing. And he did some other things. He's opened up, wildlife refuges to hunting and to other things that expanded some of our hunting access. And so I can list some things that some would say it was just political convenience that he did that. Well, okay, if it was just political convenience, I don't care. It's still a victory. But now we see in his current administration, the other side of someone who's not connected to hunting and fishing and conservation, in that he is being heavily influenced by people who view this as an opportunity to really change the landscape, literally and figuratively, as it relates to public land policy.
What Trump, unfortunately, has learned from his first administration, you can't have the administration run the way he wants if there are any, quote, adults in the room. He has no adults in the room. And the current director of OMB has an ideological position that I dare say it would be an anathema to 85% of all of Americans if they understood what he really wanted to do. He wants to sell all public lands, and that would include national parks. That is just totally wrong. And as probably most of you knew, there was an extraordinary event that took place in Yosemite when John Muir went camping with the old lion. I wish at that time somebody was there or there was a machine that would record what they discussed. Muir was a remarkable guy. He actually knew very little about camping. He didn't use sort of the things that we normally do, but his method of camping showed an extraordinary degree of toughness. He would bury deep into the litter underneath a pine tree, and then he would keep a little small fire going, and every hour he'd wake up and put a little fuel into it, go back to sleep. He'd be warm, but he'd be kept warm underneath the litter, the pine needles, and everything else. And I think even TR didn't quite do that, but he was a remarkable tough man. So next year, I believe that I'm going to go to Yosemite. We've made reservations. We're going to be staying in the lodge, and I will be meeting with Robert Hanna, who is the grandson of John Muir. and we want to use our voices jointly. I would love to invite the president to join us and camp out in Yosemite. Now, do any of you think the president would accept that invitation? So, to my knowledge, the president has never been in a wilderness area, and I don't think he's ever gone camping, with the possible exception when he was a cadet at the military academy, and they went camping because they were required to do so. But since then, I don't think he's ever gone camping. And if you haven't seen something, you haven't done anything, you actually have no connection with it.
Yeah, and that's my point of that is that, and he's an example everyone points to, but we have a lot of our politicians, a lot of our elected leaders who are disconnected from the concept of hunting, of conservation, of public lands, of access. I would bet if you went to the U.S. Senate and said, hey, how many of you have ever camped out overnight for three nights? You wouldn't get much of a show of hands. You might get 10 people who raise their hand. And you'd the same percentage probably in the House. And so as we have people, our elected officials, who are that far removed from what we all love, it's in my belief, it is more incumbent than ever on us as hunters to be that loud voice and not be afraid that we're going to offend somebody. We can agree with somebody on a different policy issue, and we can disagree with them on this policy issue. And that's part of being an adult. That's part of being a leader, is to be more focused on the issue and less concerned about who might be upset. Because I always say conservation and advocacy has three critical things. One, it's always difficult. And the folks who listen know what I'm going to say next. If it was easy, we'd call it golf. It's always uncomfortable. Someone will be upset with you. There will be critics. And that gets back to your great-grandfather's famous quote about the man in the arena. You know what? This is not easy stuff. This is going to come with its criticisms and its critiques. And I'm sure just what we've talked about here, I'm going to get a flood of emails of people who say, well, why are you talking politics? I want you to talk hunting. Well, you can't disconnect the two anymore. And then third, it's always inconvenient. There's never an easy time where it's on our calendar that, oh, Mike Lee is going to introduce this bill in late June on this day. No, we didn't see that coming. We had to be ready, and we had to answer the call when it came. And so if people don't have the stomach for that, then we're going to lose a lot of ground in the hunting space. We're going to lose public lands, or our public lands are going to become so impaired that their value to the average American is not going to be what it currently is. And my biggest concern is it reverses a trend where every generation of Americans since the time of your great-grandfather has enjoyed a greater opportunity and more wildlife and the infrastructure and the institutions that protected this for the general public. And if we aren't the ones who speak up, who will? Like you said, I don't know if you said it on the podcast here, but when we've been driving around on your elk hunt here and walking around, he said, it was really the hunters who stopped Mike Lee's idea in his tracks.
It was the hunters who stopped it. And I've had the CEOs of 3 different important wildlife or NGOs, Trout Unlimited, the National Wildlife Federation, and the Wilderness Society, tell me that with the hunters, they are able to succeed. Without the hunters, they don't think they would have succeeded. And you mentioned the word golf. A number of years ago, 2 of my colleagues said, Ted, you are a conservationist and environmentalist. How can you shoot animals? How can you? That just doesn't seem right. And I said, well, it is a little bit paradoxical, but let me explain it to you very clearly. Hunters protect wildlife. We passed the Wallop-Roe bill, which means that every time we buy sporting equipment used in fishing or hunting, part of the tax revenues that are collected go to protect wildlife. And it was hunters getting together that stopped Mike Lee's bill. Now, you both are golfers. What do you do to protect wildlife? Nothing. You build monocultures and you use herbicide and pesticide on it that gets into the water table and also adversely affects whatever wildlife may be around that. Where are you protecting wildlife, where at least hunters are and are consistent with their beliefs and their actions? They didn't have an answer to that.
Well, maybe I'm going to continue with my line where I always say if it was easy, they'd call it golf.
Yes, that's very good.
Oh, well, a lot of people don't know your story going back. This is to try to give some idea of you've seen America go through these ebbs and flows just in your life. You said you're almost 83 years old.
You didn't have to say that.
Well, I'm sorry. But wait, we got to give if we're going to give a timeline of context, we'll just start there. How's that? But when you got out of college, and the reason I say this is I think the Vietnam War is a very important time of inflection in American society. You volunteered for 2 tours as a Navy SEAL in Vietnam. You've seen America go through that. You've seen America go through, oil crisis of the 1970s. You've seen the high inflation of the late 70s, early 80s. You've seen 9/11. You were working in the building next to the Twin Towers when 9/11 happened. You've seen a lot. So I always am interested in the perspectives of people who have seen it, lived it, done it, and the lessons that they have. And so when you're sitting here talking about these things, I hope people understand that your critique of the own party, that you, going back to your great-grandfather, you've been Republicans forever.
Yeah, my TR obviously was a Republican. His oldest son, my grandfather, was a Republican, represented the Republican Party in the New York State Legislature or Assembly, ran for governor against Al Smith, got beaten, and my father was a Republican, was a commissioner in Governor Duff's administration for a while, Commissioner of Commerce. So being a member of the Republican Party is part of what our family has been. But you mentioned Vietnam, and it was an inflection point that lingers on today, unfortunately. It was the first time that it became apparent to the American public that our government had lied to us. And while I have immense respect for Lyndon Johnson for a lot of things that he did, passage of the Civil Rights Bill, etc., but he didn't know how to respond to the sort of conflict he got in Vietnam. He didn't like it, but he allowed the war to escalate in ways that made no sense, was not in the interest of people. And when Kennedy came in, he engaged in regime change. How many times have we seen regime change since then? Whether it was in Iraq with Saddam Hussein, whether it was in Egypt with Mubarak, whether it was in Tripoli with a bizarre guy, Gaddafi. Regime change has unpredictable results and generally don't work to our advantage. It's something we shouldn't engage in, yet we keep trying to use it and think that something better will come out. Yeah. It almost never does, and it's very dangerous. When I went to Vietnam, having graduated from Harvard, I looked at what was happening, and I said that this is very similar to what happened in China when you had the nationalist forces fighting the communists, and we were on the side of the nationalist forces and gave them a lot of weapons, but they didn't represent the people very effectively. And unfortunately, the Communist Party was much better representing the people, and ultimately they won that civil war. And I said, I see something like that happening in Vietnam. This is a war between North and South, but Vietnamese against themselves. And to suggest that this was a unified communist domination and the domino theory. I don't really believe in the domino theory. But once I was involved there and the bad guys were shooting at my platoon, I became quite hawkish in my views. It took me a while after I got back to put it into perspective, and I learned one of life's most important lessons. I realized that when you're so engaged in something, i.e. you've got your platoon and you're trying to protect them, I lost sight of the forest for the trees. And when I came back, I put it into perspective, and I realized that we weren't advancing our interests by engaged in this war. The good thing about the war is, in an amazing way, the Vietnamese still rather like Americans because they distrust the Chinese. And that's an opportunity for us if we're smart enough to take advantage of it. And one of the things, I'm getting to becoming long-winded, one of the great things that the Republican Party did was it was a party of internationalists, and the election between Eisenhower and Senator Taft was between for the Republican nomination was between an isolationist and an internationalist. Eisenhower won because the vision of being an internationalist and having allies. We're the only country in the world that can create a system of allies that will help us meet our common objectives. But I'm afraid that the Republican Party has lost sight of how internationalism and how we're all interconnected through trade, etc., and how that works to our interest. We've lost sight of that, and it makes us far less effective in resisting a common threat from both Russia, China, North Korea, and now probably Iran. And they have a very clear idea that the system set up by the United States should be dissolved and no longer exist. We need to come up with a way of resisting that because it's not in our interest. And the very best way of doing that is to work with our allies.
Yeah. Well, when we were out elk hunting here, we had a lot of time to talk about these things, and you were drawing these parallels that you've seen in your life, and this being one of them, of how, what you say earlier, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And we're seeing some of that now in the United States in our international and foreign policy. But you were talking about how we're also seeing some of that in our conservation policy, in our public land policy, of somewhere along the way, we forget the lessons of the past. And for whatever reasons, we seem doomed to repeat them. And I just look at our, I don't know what you'd call it, silence, our acquiescence, our accommodation to the loud voices who say, well, if you aren't going to stand up and push back on me, I'm going to go as far as you will let me. And so we're seeing that in defunding a lot of our agencies. And I'm talking about our public land stuff. And no one's going to say that the way the Forest Service operates or the way the BLM operates is, the model of efficiency. But we can't have these things that make America, our public lands, our institutions, our framework of regulations to make sure we have clean air, clean water. We can't have those for free. They don't happen for free. And they are a true American blessing that you talked about. How no other place in the world has this stuff.
I mean, I look at Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was not really a great environmentalist, but he saw the people wanted it. So we passed clean air, clean water. We had the National Environmental Policy Act that was.
Yeah.
These are bedrock to where we are, and created the EPA.
Yeah.
And now we have a Republican Party that seems determined to get rid of all of these things. And because hunters are really good, I'll call them citizen scientists. They're out there seeing nature firsthand, and they know what is happening. All of you can see that we're living in a period of extreme heat, greater drought, and that's creating an incredible risk for our national forests and the possibility of catastrophic fires, some of which, if they burn hot enough, you get hydrophobic earth, which can't absorb rainwater for generations.
Yeah.
So we are seeing the cost of this, and that means that everyone, all Americans, not just the hunters, but particularly the hunters, we must engage and become citizens. And citizens means that we have an obligation to become involved. We have to vote. We have to inform ourselves as to what the issues are. And if we sit back passively and let life just sort of unfold without engaging, we are not being responsible citizens.
Yeah, and I think if there's one of the great feelings I was left with this summer on July 1st or 2nd, whatever it was, when Senator Lee had to pull his amendment from the Senate floor. There was a U.S. Senator who was texting a couple of us explaining how many Republicans were going to vote to kill his amendment. And the reason that there were 18 Republican senators lined up to kill Senator Lee's amendment, a committee chair in their own party, which seldom happens. I mean, that's unheard of, that 18 of your fellow party members in the U.S. Senate will kill your amendment. The reason that happened is because all Americans forgot what party they were from, forgot whether they were urban or rural, and we came back to be citizens who cared. And that left me very invigorated, very excited that we can do this. But unfortunately, the politics of the day have the divide and conquer, or the nitpick about the little things, to distract us from the bigger things. Here we are. We're only 4 months past that or whatever, and we're back to bickering. Hunters fighting among hunters. You know, we fight over, well, should we allow the use of mechanical broadheads, or should we this, or should we that? And I always say it's the equivalent of your house is burning down and you're out in the front lawn worried about a couple dandelions being invasive plants while your house burns down. And
That's a great analogy.
So I was left with just this remarkable feeling of positivity and you know, spirit of conservation this summer. And I hope we can retain that. I hope it doesn't require another Mike Lee assault on public lands, because the next thing, he's learned his lesson. Him and his friends and it's not just Mike Lee, they view him as the point of the spear. He's our agent for this. There are significant numbers of people who want to see public lands disposed of. And I don't want it to come to that before we decide to rally again and speak up again. And for those of us who have platforms like I do, it's absolutely incumbent upon us. We've been granted the trust of the public. The public has said, Randy or whoever it is, I trust that you are going to filter through all this BS and you're going to feed me and tell me what is really important to my interest as a hunter, as someone who wants conservation to continue for my children and grandchildren. And fortunately, a lot of platforms take that with the same level of credibility. There are some platforms that are just concerned about the political fallout that might come, which then might have some financial outcome to it. And so I think one of the things, if I look back in history, you know, Yellowstone National Park is our first national park. And without George Bird Grinnell using his platform of Forest and Stream magazine at the time, I don't think America would have.
We'd have no national parks.
We would not have Yellowstone National Park, which then became the domino that started all of the other ones. And, you know, if your great-grandfather had worried about the critics when he formed or pronounced Pelican Island as the first national wildlife refuge. Not for birds he was hunting, but for birds he cared
for
about.
bird plumes. And,
It-
and you know, there was, it's interesting to go back in history and look at what a big business shooting these different kinds of herons and the plumes. There was a whole business where people made millinery, made these hats,
Yeah.
and luckily, women themselves said, "We are not going to wear the hats anymore."
Right.
They had a huge, and that industry died. But one of the points, Randy, you've made is that if the hunting community stays together and votes together and engages and helps engage other citizens in this, we will prevail.
Absolutely.
We cannot be. We will not. We will not lose this. But that means, we have to. There's the former chief executive officer of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's written a book about what are the obligations of being citizens. One is you've got to vote. Two, you've got to engage. Three, you have to be informed about what the issues are.
Yeah.
Read and think about it. But, Randy, you're using modern technology. The podcast is something I've come to lately. You're way ahead of me. But it's a great way of communicating with other people because it allows people of different views to come together and hear different views. And I don't like writing op-eds anymore. I've got one that I think will be coming out on the roadless rule fairly soon. But podcasts and the listeners of this is a great way of communicating. So please, please engage and stay involved.
Yeah, and I think in today's world, if you look at communications, George Bird Grinnell had somewhat of a captive audience for his longer form content because that's what it was of the day. It was print. And now today we have these little snippet sound bites, 10 seconds, 20 seconds. A podcast, the reason I will continue to do podcasts until they put me in the dirt, is it's a way to have a long form conversation on topics that has substance to it. And I know that 4 million people aren't going to listen to it. But if 50,000, 70,000 listen to it for an hour or 2 hours, there's going to be parts they agree with, there's going to be parts they disagree with, but we're all going to be left thinking about it more and hopefully motivated to speak up. And that is the whole purpose of why I do these and why you have become such a valued person to me, because your life experiences, I haven't had those that you've had. You know, I'm younger than you, and
You see, he's pointing that out.
but I'm old enough to know that life kicks us all around. Life has some pretty sharp elbows at times, and I don't want to disregard the lessons, and that I think that's part of why I'm such a big, voracious consumer of American history, trying to learn what did we do right, what did we do wrong, what were the conditions and circumstances that brought forth certain things. And I would say the number of people who have more experience than me that I seek information from is significant, and you are one of those people. You know, some folks might think that your comments about your party, the Republican Party, is sour grapes. Anyone who understands your family history would know that's not the case, because your great-grandfather, when he came back, he had to form his own party.
Yeah, because he didn't like what the Republican Party was doing.
So he formed the Bull Moose Party. And
maybe we need a new Bull Moose Party today.
well, maybe we do, you know, and if there's one thing I like about, I have some friends who are Democrats who are equally outspoken about their party.
Yeah.
That of all the errors and the blind spots within the Democratic Party. And that's where it's up to us. And I know people feel disenfranchised. They feel so powerless to the point of apathetic. And the battle is not lost until we give up.
That's so true.
And
That is so true. But if we remain engaged and involved and bring our children along, and the motivation for hunters should be, how would you feel if your grandchild said, I tried to go to Alaska and I wanted to see the Tongass National Forest. It doesn't exist anymore. Or the Eisenbeck Wilderness doesn't exist anymore. They put one road through it and they put in more road through it.
yeah.
How would you feel if that happened, if this great national frontier of Alaska was subject to relentless assault by the people who want to rape and pillage it?
Yeah. Well, I ask everybody if you can think back, or when you have this experience where you walk to a landscape and you just look around and you're in awe, that feeling of awe. What if I told you that you felt that today, or you felt that last year or 10 years ago, but your kids are never going to get a chance to have that feeling of awe, or your grandchildren will never get that chance because we fell asleep at the switch.
Great way of expressing it.
I want people to think about it in that context. How deprived would an American be if they never had a chance to see a landscape that inspired them? And we have that yet today because some people stood up and they didn't give two shits what party it was. They didn't care who the critics were. They stood up and they did it. And that's what we are the beneficiaries of today. So are we going to just timidly stand by and let it happen? And the same thing was going on 3 years ago when the prior administration submitted some plans to create huge solar opportunities for solar farms within migration corridors. And I was on that like a fire on a hay bale. I didn't care which party it was. Yeah. I don't care what party it is today. If party is your highest priority, you better be willing to accept a very low level of hunting and conservation for the future. Because the parties are more concerned about themselves than they are our interest. So if your first lens that you see everything through is your party, and again, I don't care if you're left or right, R or D, you are not going to be speaking and advocating and representing the voice of hunting and conservation. You're going to subordinate that. And I'm not going to. I end up pissing a lot of people off.
Well, that's good because you're accomplishing something when you, when people are get angry, but you've made them think.
Right.
And you may not prevail with them every time, but at least if you've made them think and second guess themselves, that's progress.
Right. Yeah, and I think about there are members of the Montana delegation that I have good relationships with, and I don't have to agree with them all the time, but when they're doing the right thing on public lands and conservation, as this summer, Congressman Zinke just flat out said, if Mike Lee's bill gets to the House, we're going to kill it. And
that was hugely important. And I wrote Congressman Zinke. I sent a little note to him through one of his staff because I wanted to make sure it got to him. And I said, the old line would be proud of what you've done. And she wrote me back, that meant a lot to the representative.
Yeah.
But that's, when TR had a great phrase, sometimes people say, it's not right for you to criticize the president, and he certainly criticized Woodrow Wilson for a number of years. But he wrote, I think, something that we should all remember. He said, the president is the most important of a number of federal officials. And when one federal official does something that's good, we should praise them. But if they do something that's bad, including the president, they should be criticized.
Yeah.
And that's what our obligation is. So we need to honor his words by becoming engaged and being in a position so we can make informed decisions about what their actions are.
Yeah. And, we could sit here for hours and talk about very pertinent thoughts and quotes and writings of his that are applicable today as history rhymes rather than repeats. And one of them is his thoughts and ideas about one generation should not skin the landscape at the expense of the other generation. Right. And I'll be honest with you, I am very concerned that we are skinning. We're preparing to skin the landscape.
We are preparing to skin the land and engage in massive intergenerational theft.
Yeah.
We all know that theft is wrong, and we should not allow it to take place.
Yeah, and I'm not gonna sit silently while that happens. And if it creates some friction,
you
know what? Friction is the result of heat, and steel gets tempered best with heat. And
good way of putting it.
My grandmother had a saying of, when someone would criticize, she's very sharp with her words. Her tongue was as pointed as you could get. And if she spoke truth and it upset somebody, she would say, "You've mistaken me for someone who's concerned about your hurt feelings." And that's kind of one of the mottos I live with, is I don't go out of my way to create hard feelings. But when it comes to wild places, wild things, and that next generation, I really can't concern myself with the hurt feelings of a hyper-partisan on either side. And, that probably is going to put some sideboards on how large my platforms will ever get, how popular they'll ever be, what my message might be. But I can't let that drive what I say, what I advocate for. And your family, going back to your grandfather, you've kind of been an example of, you know what, I'll let those chips fall where they may. Yeah. I'm going to say what needs to be said, and I'm going to sleep well at night. And so hopefully here in Montana you've slept well.
Oh, yeah. Last night I was so happy when we came back from the barn where we'd hung the elk. There was another hunter here, a young woman who went out and got a 6x6, and she was so happy. But because of her, she set the elk herd running, and by an extraordinary coincidence, we thought they were going to go around the long way, and they took a shortcut and came right in front of us.
Yeah.
So she helped us get our elk, and so I gave her a big hug to thank her. But we came back, and the elk were hanging, and we came out into this gorgeous, clear sky. There'd been a cold front that had come in, and it looked like the stars could be plucked right out of the air. They looked so close.
Yeah.
It was so good, and it reminded me of why I love Montana so much. And regrettably, I'm a country boy, but I still live in the city. And I haven't been able to fully reconcile that, but I deeply love my wife, and she loves the city because she likes to be around people. And one of the reasons I loved our ranch in Montana was I could be by myself and I could do what I wanted, and there weren't very many people around there.
Yeah. Well, yesterday when we came in, and this struck me, and it always does, I was watching Jess and Corey, Corey being the father, Jess being the daughter, both of them arms deep processing that elk. And as I stood back, I just thought, this is what is important to me, to see a father, daughter, father, son, mother, daughter, mother, son, whatever it is, a mentor-mentee relationship.
Well, I guess on that, what I'd like to say to all of our listeners, take your children and grandchildren into the wild and teach them how to hunt, and do so hunting responsibly. Yeah. Help pass this tradition to the next generation, and particularly bring the daughters in. We need more women that are doing it.
Yeah, and that was just for a minute as I just watched them working hard. It just struck me as, You know, her father is probably my age, and here is his daughter.
Yeah.
We watched her from
Yeah.
2 miles away, how she steadied, and she took so much time with her shot and
Yeah.
her selection, and she ended up making a fantastic shot. And all of that in one little, moment tells me what my purpose is. It's to make sure that other families are able to go
that
out
should
and
have
do
that, and we are so privileged to be able to go hunting on these vast public lands, and I got my first elk on a wilderness area in Idaho, and I'll never forget that. And I think I can recount every single elk that I've shot. I'm not sure I can do the same for white-tailed deer, but I can remember most of them.
Yeah.
But elk are special.
Yeah, and that was on public land in Idaho. Yeah. Well, I really have enjoyed these days with you, Ted. It was such an honor that you would call me and suggest that we go on a Montana elk hunt. And
I think it was the other way around.
Okay. Maybe
that would have been presumptuous of me, but to have the privilege of going out with the modern version of Bernard DeVoto, what more could you ask?
Oh, what do I owe you for saying that? Anyone who hasn't studied DeVoto, I've read every book about him. The most recent one by Nate Schweber is one everybody should read. I think it's called This Land of Ours. But America has had people who have stood up and stood up at critical times, and that's what this audience does. You know, if there's one thing about this audience that listens to this podcast, they are not afraid of standing up. They are motivated. They understand all the things that we've just talked about in the last hour, and it's a high priority for them. And people like you who've been there, done it, seen it, you're a motivating influence for them to continue to do it.
Good.
In spite of the...
But, it's not me. Do it for your children, grandchildren, and their children's children.
Yeah. Yeah, those still in the womb of time.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, folks, thanks for being here. Ted, we got to go over and make sure we can get your elk taken care of. And that'll be a little bit of work today, but it'll give us purpose today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks so much for being here, folks. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Ted.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here and an honor. And we'll stay in touch.
Great. I will hold you to that.
Okay.